Welcome back to the June edition of Carallel's Caregiver Conversation series. I'm Matt Perrin, Director of Caregiver Engagement here at Carallel. I have Perrin Mimms and Stephanie Banta alongside today. Hi guys. How's it going?
Hey Matt. Doing well.
Good, good. Happy to hear it. Thank you for being here as always. Probably familiar faces for the audience. I'm just going out on a limb there. But today we're talking about caregiver burnout, and really excited about this conversation. Everyone that's caregiving, there are, depending on estimates, 53 million of us providing unpaid care for a loved one in the U.S., and we all experience it differently. It's a uniquely personal journey. Few things are universal, but the risk of burnout is one of them. So really important discussion today. Per usual, a little bit of housekeeping before we jump in, and I am going to be, I try to be quick with the housekeeping because we have a lot to get to in the next 27 minutes. So first and foremost, if you're joining one of these sessions for the first time, welcome. Thanks for being here. We're Carallel. We're a caregiver support company. We help those who are helping a family member, friend, or neighbor due to aging, chronic illness, disability, etc. And we help in two different ways. First and foremost, with dedicated personal one-on-one support through our team of care advocates, of which Perrin and Stephanie are a part. And we complement that one-on-one support with our digital platform, My Care Desk by Carallel. And that's a one-stop caregiving hub for practical tools, tips, articles, videos, etc. All about all things caregiving. So, and we make our service available through health insurance plans and employers across the country. If you're not sure whether or not you have access to Carallel, ask your employer, ask your health insurance plan, and find out. So that's number one. Number two, these are conversations by design. So please do weigh in. If you have perspectives to share, questions to ask, please don't be shy. Drop them in the chat portion of the GoToWebinar console, and we'll do our best to address them on the session. If we don't, we'll certainly follow up after the session. And the last piece of housekeeping is a poll. We'd love to get a sort of perspective of the room here. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll in line with today's topic. Have you ever experienced caregiver burnout? Pretty straightforward poll. Yes, no, I don't know are the options. All right. Okay, so interesting. I'm going to go ahead and, so we have most of the vote in. We're about 80% yes, just under 20% I don't know, and 0% no. Any surprises on that, guys? I'm a little surprised by the bifurcation between yes and I don't know. No no's, no definitive no's there.
Well, I think maybe you're going to have to hit up on the description of exactly what caregiver burnout is, and then I think we should do it again at the end and see if there's any changes.
That's a good idea. Good idea, Perrin. Okay, so and also you should be in radio or TV, Perry, because that's a great segue. So let's just get right into it, right? And we're going to offer up a definition of caregiver burnout to set the foundation. We'll touch very briefly on the causes. I think many of them, whether they're obvious or not, I think they'll be familiar to many of us who are caring for a loved one or have done so in the past. And we're going to spend the bulk of the time on how to spot it and what we can do about it. So definition-wise, this is how Hopkins Medicine, pretty trusted, credible source, defines burnout. Burnout's a state of emotional exhaustion that results from failing, wearing out, or feeling totally used up due to too many demands on one's energy, strength, and resources. Discuss. Yeah. What are your, I love the word, I mean, I think it's a great description or definition rather. The word used up, or the phrase used up, really just hits me in the heart. It's a bullseye. What are your thoughts on that definition?
When you feel like you have nothing left to give or that you can't, I agree with that. There are some different versions of definitions for this. I agree, this is one of my favorites because I think it's really inclusive of all kinds of caregivers. It's just not for the caregiver that's in the room providing personal care or something like that, but this also includes caregivers near, far, and providing emotional or financial support, all those different things. So I do think it's a very inclusive description of what burnout can be.
And I think we know that in our world today, a lot of people experience burnout who are not caregivers. And because when we become a caregiver, all our other obligations don't go away. I think this definition is really on point. And at most caregivers will say that at some points in their journey, they have felt this.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with both of those points, and I have nothing to add. If I'm being totally honest, but I do echo Perry's sentiment on the inclusivity of it, because I had this caregiving mentor, let's say, that at one point in time, she said to me, just because you don't live under the same roof doesn't make you any less of a caregiver. Right? And those words have stuck with me, and I think align certainly to Perry's point. So let's just quickly, and I see a couple of comments. We have our first sort of comment. The first comment of this kind, which is awesome, but it says this is going to be a good one to sit in on this session. So love to see that. Thank you. And I have a question that I see in the inbox around kind of signs of burnout, which we're going to get to in a minute. Before that, though, let's just touch briefly on the causes, and we can sort of rapid fire list them out, not necessarily click into each one, but I mean, the first, caregiving is a massive life change, right? Whether, and sometimes that change happens in the blink of an eye, when somebody becomes a caregiver in a sudden situation. Other times it takes years. It took me years, given, my mom was living with dementia, but it was a massive life change nonetheless. And then there are the expectations, right? And just the weight of those expectations, the lack of control, right? We, as caregivers, we have very, very little certainty or control, and just the weight of it all, the unrelenting demands, right? Which I think some of the words in that definition sort of speak to. But what are some other causes? I mean, do you guys agree with those, Perry, Stephanie, and are there any others that come to mind?
I absolutely agree with each one of those. Those are all factors. And whether your caregiving journey started quickly or gradually, most of us enter into it feeling unprepared. And often we have a picture in our heads thinking, oh, I'm sure all the other caregivers are doing this just fine. What's my problem? And so we can tell you for certain there are no perfect caregivers out there. We all struggle from all the factors that you're talking about that make this very challenging as well as satisfying.
Yeah, there's a lot of satisfaction, but there is a lot of challenge. And I guess woven through some of those causes, and another point that the definition touches on, but for me anyway, there was just a pervasive sort of feeling of failure along the way, under the weight of it all, and I think for me anyway, that sort of looking back now from where I am today, that sort of consistent feeling of failure contributed to my bouts with burnout. I think it was almost like, what's the point, right? I'm not going to get it right, sort of thing. A defeated sort of sense of just sort of state of mind at times is how I felt. Any other sort of anything we're missing on causes that the audience should know?
I just like separately and kind of in line what you were saying, like I think burnout is something that also comes when things are going almost well when you aren't feeling, because you are trying to do everything correct all the time. You know, if one thing drops, the whole thing can crumble. You know, and just feeling the weight and the anticipation of what can go wrong is also something that leads to that huge amount of strain, burden, and burnout. So it's not even what you're going through and what you've been through that causes it. It's your expectations for the future.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'd
Yep.
agree with that. So often the condition that our loved one has is unpredictable. And so that can leave you, even when things are going well, kind of on edge, waiting for that next shoe to drop. Um,
hmm
and
hmm
I would add that caregiving does put a family under stress, and one of the stresses that's very common is it can bring out some family conflict, or can highlight some of the ways that we interact with one another that maybe are not so helpful. Um,
Yeah,
that can cause stress.
Hmm.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay, let's now kind of move on to the signs, how we spot it. I want to go back to the question from the audience. Um, so what are what's the first sign that someone will notice that you're burning out? Right. So I guess before I put that question to the panel, as it were, I'd sort of make a couple of points. Number one, the signs that we're talking about here are, and correct me if we actually didn't talk about this when we were preparing for the section, but these signs are really for us as the caregiver, to help ourselves notice, right? And of course, we all rely on others to get through these journeys, and the hope is always that if we're not seeing something, someone that we know and trust and love will, right, and help point us out. And I would hope that would happen with burnout. But these signs are really about us being able to recognize. And the second, my first answer to it would be the question of what's the first sign is it depends, right? Because everybody experiences it differently. I mean, do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
I do. Yeah. I mean, I know for me personally, frustration is one of the first thing that hits. A frustration with things that normally I would be able to ride out, a quickness to reach that frustration,
Mhm.
or anger sometimes can come out of it too. Like it's kind of tied together. But if you feel that you're quick to anger, quick to cry, quick to feel that frustration, I find that to be a sign that, burnout is here. You've reached what feels like the end of your rope at this point in time.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it was having that going from stress to burnout was having that thought of, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. I don't
Mm.
know how much, longer I can go on like this. That's a thought to stop and pay attention to.
hmm hmm Yeah. I had that thought for sure. And both of those were on my list. So great minds think alike. We have that going for us. Um, another sort of sign for me, not necessarily telltale when I was in it, but sort of a dulling of my interest and sort of withdrawal from friends or things I used to like to do. Now, this one was particularly tough, especially on the interest side, because when we're caregiving, we have less time to do them, right? We're not doing them as much. But that was certainly to use Stephanie's words, sort of a sign to pay attention to, for me.
Yeah, and that's so funny. Not funny actually, but it's so interesting because one of the things people talk about a lot as when you're caregiving is take time for yourself, keep in your hobbies, do this self-care, all these things. And then when it comes down to it, if you have started finding yourself withdrawing because even the idea of self-care is overwhelming, yes, you have less free time to do it, but also, are you too exhausted to actually do it?
Right.
Maybe like one of those things that really brings you joy is being out in your garden, weeding, whatever it is. Like it could be different things. Maybe it's a sport, maybe it's coffee with friends. And the idea of even getting to the point where you can start doing something that you enjoy, you feel like you don't have the energy for it, that
Mhm.
is a huge red flag.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to
Yeah.
each their own, Perry, not to get off track of this serious topic, but to each their own, but weeding is not on the top of my list of things that I enjoy.
It's
Just
very
clarifying that,
therapeutic, Matt.
just clarifying that for the record. But point taken, absolutely. Um,
And
how about sleep as a
that's
sign?
that's definitely a sign that comes up frequently. I think caregivers often find it difficult to sleep because you've got too much on your mind. You're physically exhausted, but you're also mentally exhausted, and you've got that checklist. And when it's finally time for you to relax, your brain is still whizzing around with all the things you didn't get done today and all the things you need to get done tomorrow. And it can be sort of a vicious circle. So,
Yeah.
having too much on your plate makes it hard to sleep. And then when you don't get a good night's sleep, you wake up not as able to deal with the things that are in your life. So it can
Yeah.
kind of go round and round like that.
Right. Yeah. And it's the difference, right? It could be you're sleeping more, could be you're not getting enough sleep, but just, I guess, fair to say that the change from whatever your baseline is personally,
Yeah.
right, is the thing.
Yeah. But that waking up not feeling refreshed, feeling like you're running on empty.
Yeah.
I'm also going to add, just as a side note, that it's very important to know it leads to caregiver burnout, and it's very important to recognize these things. It's very important to report them as well. If
Yeah.
you are feeling these things, please, 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 even if it's just admitting it to your loved one or having this conversation with a
Mhm.
trusted physician or medical provider, this is something that should not be overlooked. There are
Yeah.
things that can help with this, and reporting what's going on with you is extremely, extremely important to your own health and the health of your loved one, because if you're not healthy, it's very hard to manage the care of somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there can be this other circular thing where the the things you're experiencing can cause depression, and then depression in and of itself gives you that feeling of complete exhaustion,
Hmm.
mental fog, and many of those symptoms that make it then harder to cope with the things you're trying to deal with.
Right. Okay. So great, very important points at the end there, both on vocalizing, communicating how you're feeling. If you're feeling this way, we'll come back to that in a second because that's obviously a critical piece of what do we do about it. And Stephanie, wanted to ask you about a couple of other signs before we get into what we can do about it. But when my wife and I we were caring for my mom and my father-in-law at the same time. My father-in-law was living in our home. My mom was living in a memory care community, and my wife Lindsay was getting sick frequently. And it was noticeably different than our pre-caregiving uh, life, right? So, I mean, that's another sign, right? We didn't know it at the time, but when we think about being run down and the exhaustion that you're talking about, that's one manifestation of it, right?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And then you may have the additional anxiety of feeling like you're sick and you can't
Yeah,
get to your loved one, or you can't do the things you need to do, and you're worried that you're going to give them the cold or the flu or whatever it is that you have, especially if they are,
right.
very vulnerable to that.
Yeah. Okay. So, reminder to the audience. Questions, if you have perspectives to share or insights, please do share. So let's, we're at 20 past. We'll let's spend the rest of the time talking about what we can do about it. And I think about this in sort of two buckets. One is the things that we can be doing beforehand to, kind of in line with the point you made, Perry, about like, when things are going well, you're not feeling like you're at risk for burnout, you're not run down, you got it all handled. What are things we can be doing in those times to actually be mitigating our risk of burnout? We probably can't avoid it altogether. I mean, caring for someone else is just inexplicably difficult. But what are the things we can be doing to mitigate our risk beforehand? And then the reactive, if we do think we're burned out, what can we do, right? So, we've mentioned expectations a couple of times. I feel like one of the things we can be doing from a proactive perspective is sort of working to revise our expectations. I found that I was constantly trying to fix my mother, right? She was living with dementia. There was no fixing, right? I should have been focused on supporting or channeling my energy towards that. And then, her abilities were changing as her disease progressed, but my expectations didn't. That friction, that incongruity was a real source of stress and frustration and ultimately at times burnout. I mean, how do you feel about expectations as, adjusting expectations as a mitigating tactic?
So in the proactive camp, so things are going well and you're looking at trying to manage your expectations moving forward, although this is important while you're in the mix of it as well. I do believe educating yourself on the disease and the progression of the disease and having conversations with the professionals that are assisting your loved one, whether it's a nurse, a doctor, neurologist. What can we expect? What does this look like in the future? Because that can help you kind of get on the right path and start off pulling in those unrealistic expectations, and also giving you almost a guide on what you need to do in order to be prepared for that progression.
I love that. And that's a really good segue to another thing that I know we talked about, another thing we can be doing, but acknowledging our barriers, right? So if we're having that conversation, Perry, to your point about what realistically can we expect with dementia or Parkinson's or our loved ones, whatever the condition is, then that would conceivably make it somewhat easier to identify our barriers and hopefully address them. How do you feel about that, Stephanie and Perry?
Yeah, just to circle back to the previous thing, I think having realistic expectations helps you to realize that your caregiving is not going to change the progression of the disease. And I just wanted to mention, we had a caregiver who said, my goal was to make my mom smile at least once every day. I thought, now there is a good,
I love it. Yeah.
A good goal.
Yeah.
So in terms of the barriers, they may be financial, they may be medical, they may be emotional. There are resources out there to help you deal with whatever is in your way. The problem is it can be very confusing and difficult to try to find the resources that may be there for you. It can be kind of overwhelming because there is no one magic location that hits them all at once. But learning about where you can go, and it can even start with your loved one's doctor, the hospital where they're getting their care, which will have a social work department, your local area agency on aging or aging and disability resource center. If you Google that, you will find one. They can tell you a lot about resources in your area. And sometimes also Googling organizations that are focused on whatever disorder your loved one is dealing with, which can get you to support groups. It can get you to helpful techniques. It can get you to local social service agencies and other programs your loved one might be eligible for.
Yeah. I just love the idea of acknowledging the barriers as like just a foundational step, because when you're in it, you don't know what they are, right? You're just like, you're brute force, right, Perry? I mean, you're trying to just do all the things, and it can be very helpful to step back and likely with the help of someone else, spot where you could really use some help.
Well, absolutely. And then like there are the barriers that Stephanie was just talking about. Those are very broad, but there are
Yeah.
going to be specific things that might be easier to pinpoint right off the bat. Like, oh, they don't walk very well and their bedroom is on the second floor of their house. That is a huge barrier. Somebody's been falling and you're worried about the steps, right? Like that is a physical barrier in the house. Finances can be a huge barrier as well when people need extra help in the home.
Yeah.
And then you as a caregiver, different from the care that you're giving to somebody else, you may have your own limitations. I need to work 40 hours a week to pay the bills. I cannot be there for my loved one during that time. I mean,
Yeah.
that is a big barrier to you being able to maybe give the care that you want to give. Realistically looking at these situations and acknowledging them will help you get ahead of it instead of saying like, well, I can take off next Friday, but that isn't a
Right.
long-term solution
Yeah.
for I need to be working.
Yeah, and I love that. And we're time flies when we're in the midst of these discussions, so we're coming up on time. But that relates segues nicely into or puts into the right context the next thing on our list, which was create a care team, which is something we talk about often in these sessions. But the care team doesn't necessarily have to be family and friends. It could be local service providers, local organizations. So the ideas we talk about frequently in these sessions about visiting or calling your local area agency on aging to see what programs are available that map to the barriers that you've identified, right? Calling your loved one's insurance company to see what benefits might be available, things like that, and complementing whatever friends and family you're able to have involved, if you are, with local service providers. But creating a care team is, it can sound sometimes just innocuous when we talk about it, in these sessions, because we talk about it so often. But the reason we talk about it so often is because it's vital to so many aspects of not just sort of surviving caregiving, but living well through it, is if that makes sense, right? And in the context of today's conversation, of course, we're talking about living well through it means doing our best to avoid getting to burnout as much as we can, right? So those are really the core pieces of the proactive mitigation, proactive ways to avoid burnout. Reactive, Perry, you already hit on it. The core theme is talk to someone, right? Talk to someone about it. I mean, what else? What are our other thoughts on when we're in burnout, what we can do about it?
Do you want to go ahead?
Talking with your loved one's doctor can be very helpful and can lead you to some helpful resources. Telling family and friends, you are going to have sometimes family members find it in their vested interest to see you as perfect and not needing any help, but you can pull out things that even someone who doesn't live nearby can do. Can they do the research? Can they pay some of the bills? Can somebody come in and give you a little bit of time off? So that can be a really important help. Is there a support line that you can call? Just have somebody to talk to and who will listen, who understands the situation you're in and may know of some resources that you haven't thought of.
Yeah. Real quick, 30 seconds on, there's a question that came in. So we talk about care team and the proactive side of this, the proactive bucket. What happens when the support team is broken? That's the question from the audience. Like, what can we do, right, as a caregiver? Because that does happen, right? We have a care team.
Absolutely.
It crumbles at certain points or not, but like, what can we do when it's broken?
Absolutely.
Any ideas?
I think acknowledging that it's broken is one of the first things, coming to terms with what isn't working, what's not helping, what's causing more issues, and then working. I mean, listen, it's one of those huge barriers. If your siblings or your family members or your neighbor can no longer help you with something that they were helping before, it's time to find alternatives. So whether that's, and to get specific in some areas, whether that's respite care, whether that's a a faith-based community, having somebody from a local faith-based community come in and just help you in the moment so that you can figure out a long-term plan. Things like adult day centers sometimes. I mean, often they're wonderful places for people to have activities and socialize, but also from the caregiver's point of view, it gives you some time to get your ducks in a line so that you can start reaching out. And when we say care team, yes, family and friends, yes, community, but also professionals. So, whether that's having to hire outside help, and I know the financials can be a barrier as well, there are low income programs that can help with this. Any of those things, every little bit adds up.
Yes.
There's not going to be one thing that solves all of this. This is like just take from here and here and here until you build up enough of a buffer that you can continue on.
Yeah, I love that point, and we're going to leave it there because that is really sort of underscores everything we've been talking about today. Not one thing solves the problem. Not one thing is just the magic elixir. It's a combination of all these little bits and bytes that we can put together. And so hopefully people are able to take something away from this conversation as it relates to staving off or coming out of burnout. If there are follow-up questions, please feel free to email them to your invitation. Those will come directly to me, and we will be sure to respond. Really appreciate you both being here, Perry and Stephanie. Thank you so much. Audience, we love doing these sessions and glad you could attend today. The next session will be July 19th. At noon Eastern, we'll be talking about everything a caregiver needs to know about adaptive clothing. So I'll be joined by Andrea Worcester from Silvert's Adaptive Clothing to talk about that. And that is something I wish I was clued in on when I was in the midst of my caregiving year. So hope you can join us then, July 19th. The schedule link will be in the follow-up email you get from this session. So with that, we'll sign off. Perry, Stephanie, thanks again. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a good day. Take care.
Bye-bye.